They said Duke Cassian Ashbourne had never raised his voice in anger. They were wrong. He had simply never needed to. A man who could end a bloodline with a signature, collapse a merchant empire with 3 words to the right ear, or strip a family of its peerage before their carriage reached the city gates had no use for volume. The truly powerful never shouted. They waited. And when Cassian Ashbourne waited, the whole of England felt it in the marrow of their bones, that cold, absolute stillness of a predator that had already decided the outcome before its prey understood the game had begun. What no one understood yet, not his allies, not his enemies, not even the young woman who would change everything, was that the most dangerous thing about the Duke of Ashbourne was not his power. It was the moment he chose to use it for someone else. The morning they brought the petitions, Cassian was already at his desk. It was not yet 6 o'clock. The candles were still lit against the gray September dawn pressing at the tall windows of Ashbourne House's east study, the ones that faced the garden rather than the street, because Cassian had long since stopped caring what the street looked like. Graydon, his secretary, had arranged the correspondence in 3 stacks: social obligations, duchy business, and what Graydon privately called the trouble pile, which was always the tallest. Cassian worked through the trouble pile first. He always had. The Duchy of Ashbourne stretched across 6 counties in England's northwest, encompassing mining interests, agricultural estates, 2 functioning ports, a wool trade that supplied a quarter of the northern mills, and approximately 9,000 souls who woke each morning with their livelihoods contingent on decisions made in this study. Cassian understood this with the same flat clarity with which he understood everything, not as burden or privilege, but as fact. Facts were the only currency he trusted. Facts could not flatter you, could not lie to advance a social position, could not look at you with wet eyes and a rehearsed tremor in the voice and expect you to soften. He was reading the 3rd petition, a land dispute involving 2 tenant families in Westholme whose conflict had been festering for 6 years through 3 previous estate managers, when Graydon knocked. "Lord Fenwick's man has arrived, Your Grace." "He's an hour early." "Yes, Your Grace." Cassian set down the petition and looked at Graydon over the edge of it. Graydon was 53, had served the duchy for 21 years, and had the particular quality that Cassian valued above almost all others in his household staff. He did not interpolate. He stated facts and waited. "Send him to the blue parlor. I'll finish this first." "Yes, Your Grace." And Graydon, "Your Grace. Tell Mrs. Aldridge not to offer him anything from the good service. The everyday will do." A pause so small that another man might not have caught it. "Of course, Your Grace." That pause told Cassian that Graydon understood perfectly. Lord Fenwick had sent his man an hour early as a test of hospitality, a soft probe for weakness, a way of measuring whether the Duke of Ashbourne could be hurried. The everyday china was the answer. Cassian had no interest in tests. He finished the petition, wrote a note of resolution at the bottom in his dense, efficient hand, and moved to the window for exactly 2 minutes. This was not sentiment, it was practice. He had found years ago that 2 minutes of stillness between distinct types of work kept his mind from compressing problems together, from carrying the emotional residue of one matter into the clean assessment of another. He looked at the garden without seeing it. Then he went to meet Fenwick's man. Lord Fenwick's steward was named Croft, and he had clearly dressed for the occasion in clothes that cost more than most men in the duchy earned in a year. He stood when Cassian entered the blue parlor, which was the correct response, and he had the good sense not to speak first, which improved Cassian's assessment of him marginally. "Your letter arrived Tuesday," Cassian said, taking the chair nearest the unlit fireplace. He did not gesture for Croft to sit. It was vague. "My lord wished to speak with your grace on a matter of some delicacy. Your lord sends his steward to conduct delicate business. That tells me either the matter is not as delicate as he claims, or Lord Fenwick lacks the spine to address it himself. Which is it?" Croft blinked. He was a man accustomed to managing difficult conversations, Cassian could see that, but he was also a man who had been briefed on how to navigate social grace, not on how to navigate the absence of it. "Lord Fenwick has great respect for your grace's time. Then he should have come himself and not wasted it on a proxy." Cassian leaned back in the chair, not from ease, but from the particular efficiency of a man who understood that physical stillness created more pressure than physical restlessness. "What does Fenwick want?" A beat. Croft adjusted, and Cassian noted that adjustment with the same clinical interest he gave to everything. The way a man recalibrated when his prepared strategy collapsed was always more informative than the strategy itself. Lord Fenwick wishes to discuss the matter of the Harrow estate. The Harrow estate. Cassian kept his face neutral, which was not difficult because his face was always neutral. But somewhere behind the neutrality, something sharpened. That estate is not in dispute, Cassian said. It passed to its current occupants through Lady Harrow's second marriage to Phineas Harrow, whose death 3 years ago left the estate in the administration of his widow, Dorothea Harrow. Yes, Your Grace, Lord Fenwick is aware of this. Then Lord Fenwick is aware that it has nothing to do with me. Lord Fenwick believes... Croft paused, and this pause was different from the small recalibrations before. This was a man choosing words with the care of a man who had been specifically instructed to choose them carefully. Lord Fenwick believes there may be irregularities in the original inheritance documentation, specifically regarding the disposition of assets belonging to the late first wife. The room was quiet. In the street outside, a cart passed, the sound of wheels on cobblestone briefly audible and then gone. The first wife, Cassian said, Lady Margaret Harrow, née Ashby, who predeceased her husband by 11 years, and her daughter, Evelina Harrow. Croft's expression shifted, but not in the way Cassian expected. There was something behind it. Not quite discomfort, not quite guilt. More like the expression of a man who had been told to open a door and had just discovered the door was heavier than he was prepared for. Lord Fenwick has an interest in the matter of Miss Harrow's inheritance, yes. Lord Fenwick, Cassian said, has a son of marriageable age and declining financial prospects. His interest in Miss Harrow's inheritance is not a matter of legal irregularity. It is a matter of access. Croft said nothing. Tell your lord, Cassian said, standing, which in this room and in this context was a dismissal as absolute as a spoken command, that the Harrow estate sits within Ashbourne's wider administration, and that any claim regarding asset irregularities must be filed through the proper legal channels, which Fenwick already knows. Which means this visit was never about legal channels. Your Grace, and tell him, Cassian continued, moving toward the door, that sending a steward to probe a duke's patience before breakfast is the sort of miscalculation a man should only make once. He left Croft in the blue parlor. Graydon was waiting in the corridor with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had been listening through walls for 2 decades and had simply gotten better at not appearing to. The Harrow estate, Cassian said, pull whatever documentation we have on the original inheritance, the first wife's assets, specifically. Yes, Your Grace. And find out who else has been making inquiries about it. Graydon's expression did not change. I already have a partial list, Your Grace. You are not the first to ask, yet. The gathering was called a reception, which was the polite word for what it actually was. Cassian knew what it was. Every person who received an invitation to Ashbourne House on the 14th of October knew what it was. His mother had died in March, and with her death went the last obstacle to the one conversation the entire northern aristocracy had been conducting around him for 11 years, the question of who would become Duchess of Ashbourne. Cassian had agreed to the gathering for reasons that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with strategy. His solicitor had advised it, his estate manager had advised it. 3 separate members of Parliament who owed him favors had, in delicate and indirect language, advised it. An unmarried duke of his wealth and position was a political liability, not to himself, but to the various alliances and agreements that depended on the stability of his line. Cassian understood this. He accepted it with the same flat practicality with which he accepted everything. He did not look forward to it. The 14th arrived with a cold, sharp sky and a wind that came off the northern moors and cut through wool like it had a personal grievance. Cassian stood at the first-floor window of the East Gallery and watched the carriages arrive with the particular quality of attention he gave to everything. Comprehensive, unemotional cataloging. The Marchioness of Eversley. Her 2 daughters, both of marriageable age, both trained to laugh at the right pitch. Lord Caldwell and his wife, neither of whom he particularly respected, but whose land bordered his own to the south. Sir Alistair Wren, who was charming and entirely useless. Lady Pemberton, who was neither charming nor useless, and who would be watching the room with the same clinical interest as Cassian, and probably reaching better conclusions. The Fenwick Party. He noted the Fenwick Party with particular attention. Lord Fenwick himself finally making an appearance, stout and florid-faced, with the practiced hardiness of a man who had learned that people liked him better when he seemed uncomplicated. His son, Edmund Fenwick, who was handsome in the way of men who had never been required to develop anything beyond their looks. And behind them, climbing from the carriage with the careful self-effacement of people who had been trained to take up as little space as possible, the Step family. Cassian had read the documentation Graydon provided. Dorothea Harrow, née Caldwell, second wife of the late Phineas Harrow. Her two daughters by her first marriage, Philippa and Cecily, whose surnames were technically not Harrow, but who had adopted it with a thoroughness that suggested deliberate erasure of their prior identity. And with them, last out of the carriage, not in the place of prominence, but at the edge of the group, a young woman he had not seen before. She was dressed well enough, but the dress was wrong for her in a way that was not accidental. Too much fabric at the shoulder. A color, a deep rust that was nearly brown, that flattened her complexion instead of lifting it. The sort of choices a woman with access to a dressmaker might make if she wanted someone else to look diminished. Cassian filed this without expression. He knew a deliberate campaign of diminishment when he saw one. He had been executing them himself since he was 22 years old, and he had never once done it with as much naked enthusiasm as Dorothea Harrow seemed to deploy it. He went downstairs. The grand drawing room of Ashbourne House could hold 200 people comfortably, which meant the 140 gathered there that evening produced the particular pressure of a room that knew it was being watched. The candlelight was arranged to flatter. The music was present but unobtrusive, and the footmen moved with the smooth efficiency of a household that had been trained to make comfort appear effortless. Cassian moved through it in the way he moved through everything, without appearing to hurry, without stopping to linger, without giving any single person the prolonged attention they were all angling for. He spoke to the Marchioness of Eversley for 2 minutes, during which she managed to reference her elder daughter 3 times. He spoke to Lord Caldwell about the Southern Boundary Survey for 4 minutes, during which the actual conversation took 90 seconds, and the rest was Caldwell trying to read whether he was being evaluated for something. He spoke to Lady Pemberton for 6 minutes, and this was the only conversation that evening in which both participants said what they actually meant. "You look like a man counting exits," Lady Pemberton said. She was 70, had survived 4 monarchs and 2 husbands, and wore her white hair unadorned. "I'm counting the rooms they weren't worth opening," Cassian said. "And the girl from the Harrow party?" He looked at her. She smiled, which on her face was more unsettling than a frown. "I've been watching her since she arrived. Someone went to a great deal of trouble to make her look unremarkable. They almost succeeded." Cassian said nothing. "She's been positioned near the north wall for the past 40 minutes, Lady Pemberton continued. "Her stepsisters are circulating. Her stepmother is circulating. The girl stands at the wall and does not reach for the champagne, which suggests either she's been told not to or she's too intelligent to dull herself in hostile territory. You've been watching her longer than I have." "I've been watching her," Lady Pemberton said, "because she reminds me of someone I used to know, a long time ago, before that person learned to stop being visible." She moved away before he could answer, which was the kind of social cruelty that only the very old and very powerful could execute without consequence. He found her at the north wall. Not found her in the sense of seeking her out. Cassian did not seek people out, particularly not at gatherings designed to make him do exactly that. But the room had its own geography, and the northern end of it was where the secondary fireplace was, and he had a genuine need to speak with Lord Aldgate, who was standing 20 feet from where Evelina Harrow was standing, and so their proximity was functional, not orchestrated. He told himself this with the kind of precision he applied to everything, and noted in the same breath that he was telling it to himself at all. She was looking at a landscape painting on the north wall when he passed her. She did not look at him directly, which, in this room of 140 people angling for exactly that, was remarkable. Most people looked at him. Some looked away with studied casualness when he glanced at them, but they had already been looking. She was looking at a painting of the Yorkshire moors, and her expression suggested she was actually seeing it. "The perspective is wrong," he said. He had not intended to say anything. She turned. She did not startle, which he noted. And her expression, in the half-second before social management came down over it, was not the calculation he was accustomed to from every woman in this room. It was the face of a person who had been genuinely interrupted from a thought. "The horizon line," she said, after a pause that was half a beat too long to be performed and exactly the right length to be real. "It's too high. The moorland reads as a slope when the painter wanted a plane." He looked at the painting. She was correct. "The painter was Hedderly," she said. "He had a tendency to work from memory rather than studies. It makes his interiors very good, and his landscapes unreliable." "You know Hedderly's work?" "My father had several of his pieces, the interiors." A pause, and in that pause something moved across her face that she did not entirely manage to conceal, something that might have been grief if it had been allowed to be. "He sold them in the last year of his illness. Or someone sold them." The last four words were quiet and flat, in the specific way that things go quiet and flat when a person has spent a great deal of time making peace with something that does not actually deserve peace. Cassian looked at her. Not the way he had looked at the carriages arriving, not the cataloging assessment, but something different. The kind of looking that a man does when he has unexpectedly encountered something that does not match any category he has prepared. "Evelina Harrow," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Your stepmother has been trying to catch my eye for the past 20 minutes. Something crossed her face that was too controlled to be amusement and too alive to be nothing. She's very determined." "Is that what that is?" The not quite amusement sharpened just slightly. "Lady Harrow has 2 daughters to establish. That requires access to the right rooms." "And you?" "I don't require access to rooms, Your Grace." "Everyone in this room requires access to rooms." "Some people," she said, "have learned that rooms require more than they're worth." She looked back at the painting. It was a dismissal so clean and so without self-consciousness that Cassian stood with it for a moment before he understood what it was. In 11 years of gatherings and political maneuvering and the particular social theater of his rank, no one had ever simply turned away from him mid-conversation, not with rudeness, not with calculated coyness, simply because she had said what she meant and was finished. He moved to find Lord Aldgate. He did not look back at the north wall. He was aware, with a precision that mildly irritated him, that he wanted to. The incident happened an hour later, and Cassian was aware of it before he was aware of being aware. The way the room's sound shifted, not louder but denser, the way the music continued but the conversations around him shortened, people's attention snagging on something at the east side of the room. He turned. It took him 3 seconds to understand what he was seeing. Evelina Harrow was standing at the center of a loose circle of people near the east archway. The back of her gown, the rust-brown dress he had noted as deliberately chosen to diminish, was torn. Not frayed, not caught on something. Torn. The fabric had been pulled apart from the neckline down in a way that exposed her back and left the bodice barely held by a single hook, and she was standing very still with both arms crossed in front of herself, holding the fabric against her chest with the concentrated stillness of someone who has made a decision not to collapse. Philippa Harrow was standing 6 feet away with an expression of theatrical dismay that she was not bothering to make entirely convincing. "Oh, how dreadful," Philippa said, at the precise volume to be heard by the largest possible audience. "It must have caught on something. You really ought to be more careful, Evelina. You know you're not accustomed to rooms like this." The circle of onlookers was very quiet, not the quiet of people who were horrified and unsure what to do, the quiet of people who were entertained and unwilling to intervene in case doing so cut their entertainment short. Cassian had spent his adult life making instantaneous assessments of situations, and the assessment he made in the following 4 seconds was this. The gown had not caught on anything. The tier was too clean, too well positioned, too complete to be accidental. Philippa Harrow had either done it herself or had it done, probably in the last 10 minutes. Probably in the hallway between the drawing room and the retiring room. The circle of onlookers included 12 people he would have described as social cowards, 3 people who were actively pleased by what was happening, and Lady Pemberton, who was watching Cassian. Evelina Harrow had not moved. Her face was, and this was the thing that settled into Cassian's chest like a stone dropped into still water, composed. Not the performed composure of a woman managing a social disaster. The real composure of a woman who had survived worse than this and knew it and was deciding right now in real time whether to let it destroy her. Her chin was level, her eyes were dry. There was a muscle in her jaw that moved once. That was all. And the 138 people in the room were watching to see if she would break. Cassian took off his evening cloak. He moved through the circle without acknowledging its existence, and the people in it moved without realizing they were moving because the Duke of Ashbourne had entered their space and there was no alternative. He came to stand behind Evelina Harrow and settled the cloak over her shoulders with the efficiency of a man who had made a decision and was executing it, not performing it. The room went very quiet. He did not look at Philippa. He did not look at Dorothea Harrow, who had materialized at the edge of the circle with the expression of a woman who had prepared for many outcomes, but not this one. He did not survey the audience or acknowledge the silence. He spoke to Evelina. "The Hetterly in the East Gallery," he said, "is one of his interiors, better perspective than the Moor." His voice was entirely even, the voice of a man conducting a private conversation in an empty room. "If you'd care to see it." She turned her head to look at him, and for 1 second, just one, the composure fractured at the edges, and underneath it was something raw and exhausted and entirely unguarded, the face of a person who had not expected this and did not know what to do with it. Then it was gone. The composure came back quieter than before, but more solid. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple. They were not performing gratitude. They were just the two words that fit. "There's nothing to thank me for," Cassian said. And he meant it exactly as it sounded. Not false modesty, not calculated deflection, simply the statement of a man who did not consider basic decency to be a gift. He offered his arm. Evelina Harrow looked at it for one beat. Then she took it. They walked toward the East Gallery, and the circle parted, and the room watched them go with the kind of silence that means a story has just begun. Behind them, Philippa Harrow was still standing where she had been. Her expression of theatrical dismay now curdled into something uglier and less managed. Dorothea Harrow's hand had gone to her throat in a gesture that might have been distress, except that her eyes were too bright and too calculating for distress. Edmund Fenwick, standing against the far wall with a glass he had not touched, was watching Cassian's retreating back with an expression that was not quite jealousy and not quite anger, but contained elements of both, along with something more deliberate, something that looked like assessment. And Lady Pemberton, who had watched the entire thing from her position near the secondary fireplace, turned back to the painting closest to her, a portrait, not a landscape, and said nothing to anyone. But her expression, for the first time in the evening, had relaxed. It looked, faintly, like relief. Cool. The East Gallery was empty and cooler than the drawing room. The Hetterly interior hung between two sconces, and the candlelight played across it well, and the perspective was, as Cassian had said, significantly better than the Moor. Evelina stood before it with his cloak around her shoulders, and she was looking at the painting, and she was not performing looking at the painting, and he stood 3 feet to her left and was silent, because silence was the only thing that fit. "You didn't have to do that," she said eventually. "I'm aware." "They'll talk." "They're talking already. That's what they do. It doesn't require my assistance." A pause. She tilted her head very slightly, studying the painting's light source. "They'll assume you have an interest." "Let them." She turned to look at him then, fully, and the composure was still there, but it was the composure of someone deciding how honest to be. That's easy to say when the consequences accrue to someone else. It was sharp. It was also entirely accurate. He held her gaze. "Then tell me what consequence you want me to account for." "The inheritance documentation," she said. Her voice was level, and her eyes were very steady, and the words came out with the particular clarity of something that has been held back for a long time and is finally being allowed to move. "The papers my father signed in the last 8 months of his illness. Someone has them. Someone has made certain they cannot be found." The East Gallery was very quiet. "How long have you known?" Cassian asked. "Since the month after his death." She paused. "How long have you?" He looked at her. The question was direct, which meant she was either very brave or very past the point of caring about caution, or both. In his experience, those two things often arrived together in people who had been pushed past a certain threshold. 4 days, he said. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise. Something more complex. The recalibration of someone who had been fighting alone for a long time and had just discovered unexpectedly that they might not be. She opened her mouth to speak. The door to the East Gallery opened. It was not a servant. It was not one of the guests wandering in search of privacy. It was Graydon, and Graydon's face, which in 21 years of service had displayed approximately 4 distinct expressions, was showing the 5th one now, the one that Cassian had seen only twice in his life, and which meant something had happened that could not wait. "Your Grace," Graydon's voice was careful in the way of a man calibrating how much to say in front of a stranger. "There has been a development." Cassian looked at him. "Tell me." "Lord Fenwick's party." A pause so brief it almost disappeared. "They've produced documentation, signed by 3 members of the Northern Gentry. The claim, Your Grace, is that Evelina Harrow's father's estate was in significant debt at the time of his death. Debt that supersedes any prior inheritance settlement, and that the documentation proving otherwise is fraudulent." The gallery was perfectly silent. Cassian turned to look at Evelina Harrow. Her face had gone the particular still of a person who has just heard the exact thing they feared most and has spent enough time preparing for it that the fear itself has been disciplined into something that looks, from the outside, almost like calm. "They filed it already?" she asked. Her voice did not shake. "Filed, witnessed, and delivered to the gathering's attending solicitor within the last 20 minutes, Graydon said, "which suggests, Your Grace, that the documentation was prepared before tonight." Before tonight. Before the gathering. Before a single conversation had taken place. The Fenwick party had arrived with forged documents already in hand, and the scene with the torn gown had not been cruelty on impulse. It had been distraction. While every eye in the room was on Evelina Harrow's exposed back, while the circle formed and the silence gathered and the social humiliation proceeded at precisely the pitch designed to make her unreliable and diminished and easy to discard. While all of that happened, someone had walked to the attending solicitor's table and delivered a legal claim designed to strip her of everything. Cassian Ashbourne had been at a great many negotiations in his life. He had been deceived twice, once at 24, once at 31, and had dismantled the people responsible for both with the patient, comprehensive thoroughness of a man who considered betrayal not a personal wound, but a problem to be solved. He was not a man who felt anger as heat. He felt it as the particular clarity of absolute focus, the narrowing of all available intelligence onto a single point. He felt it now. "Your Grace," Graydon said, and there was something in his voice under the careful calibration that Cassian heard and recognized, the faint note of a man who has just realized that the situation is worse than it appeared at the top. "There is something else." "Tell me." "The solicitor who received the documentation." Graydon paused. "He's already sent for the magistrate." The magistrate's name was Horton, and he arrived with the particular self-importance of a man who had been summoned to a duke's house and was determined not to let it show that he found this terrifying. Cassian met him in the entrance hall. He did not go to the drawing room. He did not go back to the gathering. He stood at the base of the main staircase with Graydon at his shoulder and watched Horton come through the front door with his coat still dusted from the carriage ride, and 2 clerks behind him who were trying to look official and mostly looked cold. "Your Grace," Horton's bow was correct. "I apologize for the intrusion at such an hour." "You were sent for," Cassian said. "That's not an intrusion. That's a summons." "Who sent for you?" A pause. "The solicitor attending your gathering, a Mr. Price, contacted my office on behalf of whom?" Another pause, shorter this time, because Horton was reading the room with the speed of a man who understood that the wrong answer here had real consequences. "The documentation was submitted by Lord Fenwick's legal representative, Your Grace." "And Mr. Price, the solicitor I retained for this gathering in this house, sent for you without consulting me." The entrance hall was very quiet. One of the clerks shifted his weight. "Mr. Price indicated the matter was time-sensitive." "Mr. Price," Cassian said, "will need to find other work." He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "The documentation submitted to him tonight is fraudulent. I have reason to believe this, and I will have evidence to support it within 48 hours. Until that time, no legal proceeding arising from those documents will be recognized by this estate." He looked at Horton with the particular quality of attention that made people feel individually and specifically assessed. "Do you understand me?" It was not a question. Horton understood him. "Your Grace, the law requires that you respond to a credible claim. I'm telling you the claim is not credible. I'm also telling you that Lord Fenwick submitted those documents tonight at this gathering, having prepared them in advance of any stated grievance, which suggests a degree of premeditation that I would encourage you to consider very carefully before you attach your name to his proceedings. Cassian tilted his head a fraction. I would also encourage you to consider that Lord Fenwick's financial position has deteriorated significantly in the past 18 months, and that the estate he is attempting to claim through this process is occupied by a young woman whose father served this duchy for 20 years. Horton looked at him for a long moment. I'll need to speak with Mr. Price, he said finally. Mr. Price is in the blue parlor. Graydon will show you. Cassian turned away, which was the equivalent of a door closing. 48 hours, Mr. Horton. Sam. He found Evelina where he had left her. She was still in the East Gallery, still wearing his cloak, still standing in front of the Hedderly interior as though she had not moved. But she had moved. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, slightly different from before, pulled inward rather than back. The posture of a person who had been standing alone with something difficult and had made certain adjustments to carry it. The magistrate? She said, without turning. Being managed. That's a temporary solution. Most solutions are. He came to stand where he had stood before, 3 feet to her left. The documents Fenwick submitted. Do you know what they claim specifically? She turned then, and her face was still composed, but underneath it something was working. A kind of furious precision, the face of a person doing rapid calculations in real time. Debt. My father's debts. They'll claim the estate was leveraged against obligations he accumulated in the last 2 years of his life, when his illness had progressed to the point where he was signing things he couldn't fully read. A pause. He wasn't signing things he couldn't read. He was signing things he didn't write. You have proof of that. I had proof of that. Her jaw moved. The original correspondence between my father's solicitor and the estate manager. Letters in my father's hand written to me that contradict the financial picture Fenwick is trying to establish. They were in the house. She stopped. They were in the house until approximately 6 weeks after my father died, when Dorothea reorganized his study. The word reorganized carried enough weight to bend the air around it. Cassian looked at her. In 11 years of managing a duchy that encompassed 9,000 lives and the accumulated grievances of 6 generations of noble families, he had learned to distinguish between people who told him what they thought he wanted to hear and people who told him what was true, regardless of whether it served them. Evelina Harrow spoke the way the second kind of person spoke, without performance, without the subtle inflation that people added to their own stories to make themselves more sympathetic. She was simply telling him the facts, and the facts were ugly, and she was not flinching from that. The solicitor who originally handled your father's estate, he said. Whitmore. He died last year. She stilled. You know about Whitmore. He fell from his horse on the road between here and Caldwell in February. I know about it because the road between here and Caldwell runs through Ashbourne land, and unexplained deaths on my land are documented. He paused. It was documented as an accident. It was documented as an accident, she said very carefully, because the man who found him was a Caldwell tenant, and the inquest was conducted by a magistrate whose family has been in Caldwell's pocket for 30 years. The East Gallery was silent, except for the faint sound of the gathering continuing in the drawing room. Music, conversation, the particular hum of people who did not know yet what was happening in the rest of the house. You've been building this case alone, Cassian said. I've been surviving, she said. Building implies resources I didn't have. Something in the flatness of those words landed differently than she probably intended. Not vulnerability, she was too controlled for unintended vulnerability, but the kind of honesty that came out when a person had been holding something for so long that they stopped caring whether it was strategically wise to set it down. You have resources now, Cassian said. She looked at him. The look was complicated. Not gratitude, not relief, something more guarded than either. The look of a person who had been offered help before and had learned what help usually cost. What do you want? She asked. It was direct. It was also, he understood, the most important question she could ask, and she was asking it without softening it, without social disguise, because she had reached the point where she could not afford the cost of misunderstanding the answer. The truth, he said. about what happened to your father's estate, about what Dorothea Harrow took, and how she took it, and who helped her do it. He held her gaze. And Fenwick's role in it, because a man does not prepare fraudulent documents in advance of a social gathering unless he is either very desperate or very confident, and I want to know which one he is. She studied him for a moment, the kind of studying that went beyond the surface of a person's face and looked for the structure underneath, the kind of looking that people only did when they had learned that faces lied but structures were harder to fake. Fenwick is confident, she said, because he has Dorothea, and Dorothea has been preparing for this for 3 years. Then we have 48 hours to dismantle 3 years of preparation. We, she said. Yes. Another look, longer this time. Your Grace, she said, and her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not quite steady, was in fact the very first thing he had seen in her that suggested the composure was a choice she was making, moment to moment, rather than a state she had arrived at. I have been very careful not to let anyone make decisions for me, including people who meant well. I'm not making decisions for you. I'm offering you access to mine. The distinction landed. He could see it in the slight shift of her expression. Not softening, nothing so simple as that, but a recalibration, the look of a person updating information. She said nothing for a moment. Then, Dorothea keeps papers in a locked box in her dressing room. She has kept them there since the first month after my father died. I know this because I know that house, every room of it, and I know what she moved and where she moved it, and the one thing she never moved is that box. She paused. I think the original documents are in it, or copies of what she destroyed. You think? I think because I've never been able to confirm it, because getting into that room requires either her absence or her permission, and she has been very careful about both. Cassian nodded once. He turned toward the gallery door, then stopped. Miss Harrow. She looked at him. The gown, he said. Philippa did it herself, or had it done. Something moved across her face that was not surprise, but was something adjacent. The particular expression of a person who has suspected something and has just had the suspicion confirmed and is processing what it costs to be right. Yes. While your attention was on getting to the retiring room without being seen, someone was at the solicitor's table. I know. Her voice was quiet. I figured that out about 20 minutes ago. It means the scene was coordinated. The gown, the timing, the documents. This wasn't Philippa being cruel. This was Fenwick being strategic and using Philippa's cruelty as a tool. Which means, she said, and her voice was flat and precise in a way that made the words hit harder than if she had been angry, that this was never about tonight. Tonight was just the move they decided to make first. He looked at her. There will be others, she said. Whatever you do in the next 48 hours, there will be others after it. Yes, he said, there will. She held his gaze, and in the silence between them, something was established that had nothing to do with rank or circumstance, the simple functional acknowledgement of two people who had both looked at the same problem and reached the same conclusion and understood, without sentiment, what that meant. Then we should get started, she said. He found Edmund Fenwick near the drawing room's east entrance 40 minutes later, positioned with the studied casualness of a man who had been waiting where he calculated Cassian would pass. Edmund was 28, handsome, and carrying 3 glasses of champagne worth of confidence that he had not entirely earned. He smiled when Cassian approached, the smile of a man who had decided to try charm because he had run out of better strategies. Your Grace, remarkable gathering. Your household runs with extraordinary... Where did your father get the names on those documents? Cassian said. The smile stayed, but something behind it changed. A very small recalibration, quickly managed. I'm not sure what documents you're referring to. Edmund. Cassian's voice did not change. It never changed. I've known your father for 14 years, and I've spent 12 of those years watching him make decisions that were slightly too clever by half. The documents he filed tonight have 3 signatures from Northern gentry, 2 of whom I know personally. Neither of them would sign a fraudulent legal claim without significant incentive. So I want to know what incentive was offered, and I want to know it from you rather than from them, because by tomorrow morning I will be speaking to both of them, and the version of events you give me tonight is the only opportunity you will have to shape what happens next. Edmund Fenwick looked at him. The charm was still there, technically, the way a coat was still a coat after it had been soaked through. retaining its shape while being entirely useless. My father believes, Edmund said carefully, that the Harrow estate's financial history is significantly more complicated than your father's solicitors prepared those documents no later than last week, which means the filing tonight was not a response to anything that happened here. It was the purpose of being here. Cassian held his gaze without expression. Which means your father requested an invitation to my gathering, through Caldwell, I believe, 3 weeks ago, specifically to use this house as the venue for a legal action. My house. My gathering. Edmund said nothing. That, Cassian said, is the part that interests me most. Still nothing. But Edmund Fenwick's jaw had tightened in the specific way of a man who is doing rapid internal calculations and not liking any of the results. Go home, Edmund, Cassian said. Tell your father that whatever he believes he's obtained tonight, he should consider carefully whether it's worth what comes next. He turned away. It won't be, Portitron. It was past midnight when the gathering finally emptied, the carriages pulling away in sequence, and the great house settling back into itself with the particular quality of silence that follows a crowd. Not empty, but hollowed, stripped of the pressure of all those bodies and agendas. Cassian stood at the window of the study. Not the 2-minute practice window, just standing, looking at the dark street below. On his desk, Graydon had placed 2 things. The first was a note from Mr. Horton, the magistrate, confirming that no proceedings would be initiated pending review of the submitted documentation. The second was a letter, sealed, with no return address, that had apparently been delivered to the house sometime in the last 2 hours. Not by the front door, but through the servant's entrance. One of the footmen had found it on the kitchen table. Cassian opened it. The handwriting was not elegant, but it was controlled. A person accustomed to concealing their education, or accustomed to writing under conditions that made neatness difficult. The letter was short. The solicitor Whitmore did not fall from his horse. He was helped. The man who helped him has been employed by the Harrow household for 6 years, and his name is Joseph. He does not know I am writing this. If you move on the locked box before you move on Joseph, he will destroy what is in it before you reach the house. Do not go to the house first. No signature. Cassian read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk and stood very still for a moment, because what the letter meant. If it was true, and his gut said it was true, in the specific way that his gut had been saying things were true for 37 years with a reliable accuracy that he had learned to take seriously, was that someone inside the Harrow household had been watching this situation long enough and carefully enough to anticipate his next move, which meant the conspiracy was larger than he had thought. And somewhere in a carriage currently moving through the dark streets of the city, Evelina Harrow was sitting with 3 years of calculated cruelty pressing against her from every direction, and she did not know yet that the man inside her own house had been placed there to make certain that she never found the proof she needed. Cassian picked up the letter. He looked at it for one more moment. Then he walked to the fireplace and held it over the flame until it caught, and he watched it burn to nothing, because some information was more dangerous as a document than as a fact held by a single careful man. Then he went to find Graydon. I need a man, he said. Not from the household. Someone who knows how to move quietly and doesn't ask questions about why. Graydon looked at him with the face of a man who had been waiting for this specific request for approximately 21 years and had someone in mind. Tonight? Graydon asked. Now, Cassian said. Graydon's man was named Sable, which was almost certainly not his given name, and he arrived at Ashbourne House within the hour wearing a coat that had seen better decades and the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to be invisible in occupied spaces. Cassian gave him the instructions in 4 sentences. Sable listened without writing anything down, which was either professionalism or illiteracy, and Cassian, watching him, concluded it was professionalism. The man's eyes were doing the kind of rapid cataloging that took years to develop, taking in the study, the exits, the position of the desk relative to the door, the way Cassian stood. Not suspicion. Assessment. The habit of a person who survived by knowing where they were before they decided what to do next. The man's name is Josip, Cassian said. He works in the Harrow household. I need to know his movements tonight and tomorrow morning. Not his history, his movements. And the box, Sable said. Don't touch the box. Don't go near the box. If Josip moves toward the house at any point before I tell you otherwise, send word immediately. He paused. Immediately means within minutes, not hours. Sable nodded once and left through the servants' exit. Cassian stood alone in the study for a moment, and in that moment he did something he very rarely did. He ran the full architecture of the situation through his mind, not as a strategic problem, but as a human one. Whitmore, the solicitor, dead on a Caldwell road 8 months ago. Joseph, inside the Harrow household for 6 years, placed there by someone, doing what he had been placed there to do. The anonymous letter delivered through the servant's entrance, written by someone who knew enough to be useful and was afraid enough to stay hidden. Dorothea Harrow, 3 years of preparation, a locked box, and a relationship with Fenwick that was either alliance or leverage, and was probably both. And Evelina, in a carriage moving through dark streets, carrying none of this information. He sat down at his desk and began to write. The letter reached her the following morning at 7, delivered by one of his household's fastest riders to the address Graydon had obtained. Not the Harrow townhouse, where she lived under Dorothea's roof, but a smaller address, a milliner's shop on Carver Street, whose owner, a woman named Mrs. Finch, apparently received correspondence on Evelina's behalf. This told Cassian 3 things: that Evelina had anticipated the need for a private address long before last night, that she had people in the city she trusted even if she had no institutional power, and that she had been operating with considerably more strategic intelligence than her position suggested. He filed all 3 of these without surprise. He had suspected something like it since the East Gallery. The letter said only, "Stay away from the house today. Do not let Dorothea know we spoke. Send word if anything changes before noon." Her reply came back at 9, in a handwriting that was smaller and more controlled than he expected, as though she wrote with the awareness that everything she committed to paper was potentially evidence against her. Something already changed. Josip left the house this morning at first light. Dorothea did not send him. I watched from the east stair. He took nothing with him, but he locked the dressing room door from the outside before he left, which he has never done. He has the key. Cassian read it twice. Then he sent for Sable. Sable arrived looking precisely as he had the night before, which suggested either that he had not slept or that he always looked like this. His report was delivered in the same stripped-down style as his listening. No texture, no editorializing, just the facts arranged in chronological order. Josip had left the Harrow townhouse at 5:20 in the morning. He had gone directly to a public house on Merchant Lane that did not open until 8 but had a back entrance that was apparently available to people who knew how to use it. He had been inside for 40 minutes. He had left carrying a leather satchel he did not have when he entered. He had then gone to an address on the northern edge of the city, a solicitor's office, not Price, not anyone Cassian recognized immediately, a name he would need to run down, and had waited outside it for 20 minutes before the office opened. He had gone inside for 15 minutes. He had come out without the satchel. Cassian sat very still while Sable delivered this. The study was quiet. Outside, the city was moving through its morning business. Carts, voices, the particular compressed sound of a city that had been awake since before the sun. He had miscalculated. The recognition arrived without drama and without the self-protective instinct to argue against it. He had miscalculated, and he could trace the exact point where it had happened. He had assumed that Josip's value was as a guardian of the box, a man positioned to destroy the evidence if approached. He had not considered that Josip's value might also be as a carrier, that the box might not be the only repository, that whatever documentation it contained might already have copies, that Dorothea Harrow's 3 years of preparation might include a contingency for exactly the kind of intervention Cassian had been planning. The satchel was already at a solicitor's office. Whatever was in it, copies, originals, documents he didn't yet know existed, it was no longer in a locked box in a dressing room. It was in the hands of someone who had been selected specifically because they were not visible in this situation yet. "The solicitor's office," Cassian said. "The name." Sable told him. Cassian wrote it down and looked at it. The name meant nothing to him directly, which meant either the man was genuinely obscure or had been deliberately kept clear of any association with Fenwick or Caldwell. Both possibilities were concerning in different ways. Is Josip still at the office? He left. He went back to the Harrow house. He's been inside since approximately 9 o'clock, which was 10 minutes after Evelina had sent her letter, which meant she had been watching him return. Cassian stood up. Get me everything you can find on that solicitor by this afternoon. Public record, reputation, known clients, anything. Sable left. Cassian stood at the window, not the 2-minute practice window, he was past that now, and looked at the street below and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific quality of a situation that was moving faster than his information could keep pace with. It was not a feeling he was accustomed to. He had spent his adult life building the kind of intelligence infrastructure that prevented this, the network of loyal people, the documented history, the reputation that made others hesitate before acting against him. All of that was still there, but it was built for a different kind of problem, and this problem had been constructed specifically and deliberately to sit in the gaps. Someone had studied him, had studied how he moved, how he gathered information, what resources he would reach for, and in what order. The anonymous letter had not been help, or it had been help, but it had also been a redirect, pulling his attention to Josip as a physical threat to the box, while the more important movement happened somewhere else entirely. He turned this over and looked at the underside of it. The letter had arrived through the servant's entrance. Someone with access to his household, or someone who had paid for access, had placed it there. He had assumed a sympathetic informant inside the Harrow house, someone frightened enough to warn him anonymously. But what if the letter was not from someone frightened? What if it was from someone who needed him to stand still while Josip moved? His chest was doing something that was not quite what other men might call a cold feeling, but was functionally adjacent to it. He sat back down at the desk and wrote a second letter to Evelina, shorter than the first. Do not trust any information that came to me last night through unconventional channels. We may have been directed. Meet me at Mrs. Finch's address at 2 o'clock. Come without Dorothea knowing. He sent it with the same writer and sat back and waited, which was the hardest thing, because waiting when the situation was moving was the kind of discipline that cost something real. Chats. She was already at Mrs. Finch's address when he arrived. The milliner's shop was closed at 2, a small placard in the window, and Mrs. Finch herself let him in without speaking and disappeared into the back with the practiced discretion of a woman who had been doing this for years. The front room smelled of starch and dried flowers, and the particular close warmth of a small business that ran on tight margins and careful management. Evelina was standing at the window in the same coat she'd been wearing when she left last night, which told him she had not been back to the Harrow house. Her face when she turned was different, still composed, always composed, but the composure had a different texture than yesterday, tighter, the way composure looked when the thing underneath it had gotten heavier. The letter you mentioned, she said before he could speak. The one that arrived last night. Yes. I sent no letter. He stopped. I did not send anyone to your house last night, she said very precisely. I did not know your servant's entrance existed. I did not know the name Josip was relevant until this morning when I watched him leave. She paused. Whatever letter you received was not from me or from anyone acting on my behalf. The room was very quiet. Cassian looked at her, and she held his gaze with the direct steadiness of a person who understood exactly what she was saying and what it meant and was saying it anyway. Then the letter was planted, he said. Yes. To redirect my attention while the satchel moved. Yes. She exhaled through her nose. Not quite a breath, more like the controlled release of something that had been compressed. Which means whoever sent it knew you well enough to predict how you would respond to it. Knew you would send a man to watch Josip. Knew that if your man was watching Josip, your man was not watching the solicitor's office. They used my own method against me, Cassian said. He said it plainly, because it was plain, and because the quality of understanding between them had established itself at a level where there was no point in softening it. Someone who knows how I operate. Not Fenwick, she said. Fenwick is not subtle enough for this. No. He agreed with that. He had been turning it over since the study and arriving at the same conclusion each time. Fenwick was money and connections and the particular blunt confidence of a man who had never had to be clever because he had always had enough resources to make cleverness optional. This was something else. Caldwell. She looked at him. Your stepmother's family, he said. Dorothea was née Caldwell. Lord Caldwell sat 20 feet from me last night and had a perfectly managed conversation about the Southern Boundary Survey while all of this was happening around him. He paused. He stood in my house and looked me in the eye. Evelina's jaw moved in that single small way he had learned to read as the outermost expression of something considerably larger. Caldwell was my father's closest friend, she said, for 30 years. The word friend fell into the room like something dropped from a height. He watched her absorb it, not fall apart, not rage, absorb. The particular painful discipline of a person who had learned that the world did not pause to accommodate your shock, and so you processed it while moving. He had done that himself, twice in his life, and both times it had cost him something he had not gotten back. The documentation in the satchel, he said. If Caldwell is behind this, it won't just be financial records. He would have built something that implicated you directly, a reason why your claim on the inheritance is not just weakened but actively disqualified. She went very still. They would need more than debt, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. Debt can be contested, but if there were something, evidence that I had done something, acted against the estate, misrepresented something that made me look like the aggressor rather than the victim, then the legal proceedings become about your conduct rather than theirs, Cassian said. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her, the composure didn't just crack at the edges. It opened, briefly, completely, into something raw and exhausted and genuinely frightened. Not afraid of him. Afraid of the specific shape of the thing they were both now looking at clearly. There's a letter, she said. Or there will be a letter. In my handwriting, or what looks like my handwriting. Accusing my father's solicitor of mismanaging assets, requesting that Whitmore be removed, dated. She stopped, swallowed. Dated before he died. Cassian said nothing. If they have that, she said, or something like it, then everything that happened after looks like consequence rather than conspiracy. Whitmore's death becomes the result of a dismissed employee's disgrace. The missing documents become evidence that I destroyed them to cover my own actions. Fenwick's legal claim becomes the response of an aggrieved party rather than an attack. Her voice was level. The fear had gone back under because she was that kind of person, but the understanding of what it meant was sitting in the room between them, solid and cold. I don't just lose the estate, I face criminal exposure. The afternoon light through the milliner's window was thin and gray and very still. Cassian had governed a duchy for 11 years. He had made decisions that affected thousands of lives, had navigated political landscapes that would have destroyed less disciplined men, had faced opposition from people with significantly more power and significantly more malice than anyone in this room. In all of that, the thing that had kept him functional, not comfortable, functional, was the certainty that he understood the terrain, that he knew where the walls were, that no one could operate in his domain without his knowledge. He understood, sitting in a milliner's back room on a gray October afternoon, that he had been wrong about that. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough. And the thing that sat beneath that understanding, not anger, not yet, something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous, was the recognition that the person who had engineered this had used his own discipline against him, had understood that a man who valued intelligence above emotion could be predicted, could be managed, could be handed information shaped precisely to fit the way his mind moved and would follow it, because following information was what he did. He looked at Evelina Harrow. She was watching him. Not waiting for reassurance, not waiting for a plan, watching him the way she had watched the Hedderly painting the night before, with the direct, unpretentious attention of someone who actually needed to understand what they were looking at. What do you need, she said. Not what are you going to do, what do you need? The distinction mattered. It was the question of someone who understood that this had stopped being his problem to solve alone, and that she was not a complication in his plan, but a partner in a situation that exceeded any single person's capacity to manage. The name of every person your father trusted in the last 2 years of his life, he said. Every servant, every neighbor, every associate he spoke to more than twice, and every person who came to the house after his death who was not family. That will take time. We have until that solicitor files whatever is in that satchel, which will be within 24 hours if they're moving this quickly. She nodded, once, the nod of a person accepting a wait rather than pretending it wasn't there. There's something else, she said. He waited. Graydon, she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. Your secretary. He's been with you 21 years. Yes. She met his eyes. He was at the Caldwell estate the summer before my father died. I saw him there. I was visiting with my father. Caldwell was still playing the role of old friend then, and Graydon arrived on the third day. He and Caldwell spoke for an entire afternoon in the study. I was 17, and no one thought I was paying attention. She paused. I was paying attention. The room did not change. The light did not change. Mrs. Finch moved somewhere in the back, a soft sound of footsteps, and then silence. Cassian sat with it. He sat with it the way he sat with everything that mattered, without flinching, without the defensive instinct to disqualify it because it was inconvenient, without the comfort of telling himself she was wrong. He sat with it, and he looked at it, and he let it be what it was. 21 years. The trouble pile. The everyday China. The partial list of people making inquiries about the Harrow estate, already prepared. The man named Sable, produced within the hour, sent to watch Josip while the satchel moved. The anonymous letter, delivered through the servant's entrance, that had redirected everything. He had not checked who placed it there. He had assumed an outside hand. He had not checked. He had not checked because it had not occurred to him to check. And it had not occurred to him to check because in 21 years he had never had reason to question the man who managed his household's information infrastructure. And in 21 years Graydon had never given him reason. And the most elegant betrayals were always the ones that arrived wrapped in 2 decades of impeccable service. Cassian Ashbourne sat in a milliner's shop on Carver Street and felt the architecture of his own life shift under him by precisely the degree required to change everything. And he did not look away from it, and he did not reach for anything to hold on to because there was nothing to hold on to. And the only thing left was the question of what kind of man he was going to be in the next 24 hours. I need to go back to the house, he said. Cassian. It was the first time she had used his name. She did not appear to notice she had done it, which made it worse somehow. If Graydon knows, you know, then the satchel gets filed tonight instead of tomorrow, he said. Yes, he stood. Which is why I'm not going back to confront him. I'm going back to let him believe I know nothing, while you and I figure out where the original documents actually are. He looked at her. Because if Caldwell is behind this, and Graydon has been reporting to Caldwell, then everything I have done in the last 12 hours has been reported. Every move, every instruction, every name. He stopped. Except this conversation. She held his gaze. They don't know about Mrs. Finch, she said. Not yet. Then we have one move they haven't anticipated. One, he said. We need it to be the right one. She stood, and the composure was back, fully, but it was not the same composure as the East Gallery. It was harder. Something had calcified in it over the past 2 hours. Not coldness, not the performed stoicism of someone who had decided not to feel, but the real and functional toughness of a person who had just watched the last edge of safety disappear and had chosen, actively, consciously, to keep moving. Then we find the original documents, she said, without Graydon, without your household, without anyone who has ever spoken to Caldwell. She paused. Starting with the one person who knew my father and is still alive and has never, to my knowledge, been inside a room with any of these people. Who? Cassian said. She told him. And the name she gave him was the name of the last person he would have expected, and the reason it was unexpected was the same reason it might be the only thing left that could still work. And Cassian Ashbourne, standing in a milliner's shop with the full weight of a constructed betrayal pressing against every strategy he had built his life on, made the decision that the man he had been for 37 years was not going to be sufficient for what came next. Something had to break. He could choose what it was. This is a completely fictional story created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings are products of the author's imagination. The name Evelina gave him was Lady Constance Ashby, her mother's aunt. 71 years old, living in a narrow house on the east side of the city that she had occupied for 40 years and refused to leave despite 3 separate offers from developers who wanted the land. She had been Margaret Harrow's closest living relative, had attended the funeral, had attempted twice in the year following to make contact with Evelina, and had been turned away both times by Dorothea's household staff, with the explanation that Miss Harrow was not receiving visitors. Evelina had not known about the visits until 6 months after they stopped. Cassian had sent word through Mrs. Finch's network, a thing he was learning to respect with the same pragmatic appreciation he gave to any functional intelligence system, regardless of its scale. And Lady Constance had responded within 2 hours with a single line written in the firm hand of a woman who had never learned to be tentative. "Come at 6, bring the girl. I've been waiting long enough." He went back to Ashbourne House first. This was the calculation that cost him the most, because going back meant performing normalcy in a house that had become, in the space of a morning, fundamentally different from what he had believed it to be. It meant moving through rooms that Graydon had managed for 21 years with the same unhurried authority he always projected, while underneath that authority every interaction recalibrated itself against the new information, every remembered conversation acquiring a second layer of possible meaning. Graydon met him in the entrance hall. Same posture, same carefully neutral expression. Same quiet efficiency that Cassian had, for 21 years, read as loyalty and was now reading as something considerably more skilled, the particular discipline of a man who had learned to perform loyalty so thoroughly that the performance had become indistinguishable from the thing itself. "The magistrate's office sent a follow-up communication, Your Grace, and Sable reported in." "Put them on my desk," Cassian said. "I'll look at them this afternoon." He went upstairs. He sat at his desk. He read both communications with the surface of his attention, while the deeper part of it was engaged in something harder and more precise. The systematic review of every piece of information that had passed through Graydon's hands in the past 3 years, and what it meant that Caldwell had received it. The Southern Boundary Survey, the inquiry list about the Harrow estate, the man named Sable, produced so quickly and so conveniently. The letter placed through the servant's entrance, and Graydon waiting in the corridor immediately afterward to deliver it, his voice careful in the way it always was, which Cassian had always read as professionalism and was now reading as calibration. He sat with all of it until his chest had stopped doing the thing that was not quite a cold feeling, but was adjacent to one. Then he made 2 decisions. The first was that he would not confront Graydon. Not today. Not until the thing was finished and the confrontation could not be used as a tool against him. The second was harder, and it required him to accept something about himself that he had spent 11 years of governance successfully avoiding, that the architecture of control he had built, the network, the intelligence, the reputation that preceded him into every room, had been both his greatest strength and the precise mechanism of his compromise. A man who could not be surprised could not be betrayed. He had believed this functionally without ever examining it as a belief. He had been wrong. The people who needed to betray him most had simply invested 21 years in becoming invisible to the part of him that watched for threats. He wrote 3 letters. All 3 went out through channels that had never passed through Graydon's hands. A messenger service on the south side of the city that Cassian had used exactly once before, 4 years ago, for reasons unrelated to this situation. The 3 letters went to 3 people. A document examiner whose reputation for forensic analysis was known in legal circles but not in social ones, a solicitor in Edinburgh who had no connection to any of the parties involved, and owed Cassian a favor of the kind that people did not discuss in company, and Lord Aldgate, who was the one person at the previous night's gathering Cassian trusted without qualification, and whose family had governed land adjacent to Ashbourne for 60 years without a single instance of the kind of lateral maneuvering that characterized everyone else in that room. Then he went to find Lady Constance Ashby. The narrow house on the east side smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the particular contained warmth of a space that had been lived in seriously for a long time. Lady Constance herself was not what Cassian expected, though afterward he was not sure what he had expected. Something frailer, perhaps, something more worn by age. She was instead a compact, sharp-eyed woman in dark gray wool who looked at him when he entered her sitting room with the direct assessing gaze of someone who had spent 71 years learning exactly how much to trust the face a man presented to the world. Evelina was already there, seated across from the old woman in a chair that looked like it had been arranged to face the door. Lady Constance's doing, Cassian suspected, the habit of a woman who liked to see what was coming. "Duke Ashbourne," Lady Constance said. "Sit down. You're making the room feel pressured." He sat. "You want to know what Margaret left with me," she said without preamble. "Yes." Before I tell you, I want to know why it took you 3 years to come asking. Her eyes were not unkind, but they were uncomfortably direct. You govern this part of England. You have more access to information than any man in the north. My niece's daughter has been living in that house for 3 years with people who are stealing from her blind, and you are only here now. The room was very quiet. Cassian said, "Because I didn't know, and the reason I didn't know is part of what I'm here to fix." Lady Constance looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring, she apparently found enough of it. "Margaret came to me 8 months before she died," she said. "She knew she was dying, not the specific timeline, but the direction of it. She was not sentimental about it. She was practical, which is where Evelina gets it." She did not look at Evelina when she said this, but Evelina's hands, resting in her lap, tightened fractionally. "She brought me a box." Cassian kept his face neutral. "She said she had reason to believe that Phineas's, that certain people around her husband were not what they appeared. She didn't know specifically what was coming. She knew the shape of it. She said, if anything happens to the estate after I'm gone, and Evelina needs proof of what was rightfully hers, give her this." Lady Constance paused. "Evelina never came. For 3 years she never came. And when I tried to reach her, they turned me away." "They told me you had left the city," Evelina said quietly. "Both times." Lady Constance absorbed this without visible surprise, which suggested she had suspected something similar. "The box contains the original marriage settlement documents between your parents, the unaltered versions. It contains 3 letters from your father's solicitor, Whitmore, written to your mother, detailing specific concerns about a third party attempting to influence your father's financial decisions. It contains your mother's personal correspondence with Caldwell, spanning 8 years, in which she documents a pattern of behavior that she describes as," Lady Constance paused, selecting the word, "systematic." The word landed in the room like a stone. "She knew about Caldwell," Evelina said. Her voice was very controlled and completely flat. "She suspected. She documented. She protected." Lady Constance stood with the deliberate economy of a woman who had learned not to waste motion. "I'll get the box." She left the room. Cassian looked at Evelina. She was staring at the empty chair where Lady Constance had been, and the thing on her face was not grief exactly, was not anger exactly, was the compound expression of someone absorbing the specific cruelty of learning that the person who had loved her most had seen what was coming and had tried to protect her, and it had almost been buried under 3 years of calculated misdirection. Almost. "She planned for this," Evelina said. "My mother planned for this." "Yes. She knew she wouldn't be there to stop it, so she left what she could where they couldn't reach it." "Yes." Evelina exhaled very slowly. "She always said the most important thing you could leave a person was not money, it was proof." Cassian said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he had long since learned that there were moments when silence was not the absence of care, but its most precise form. Lady Constance returned with a box that was smaller than Cassian had expected, and considerably more worn, the kind of wear that came not from carelessness, but from handling, from being checked, moved, secured, checked again over the course of years by a woman who understood exactly how much it contained. He did not open it there. He did not need to verify its contents with Lady Constance present. He needed to get it to the document examiner and to the Edinburgh solicitor, and he needed to do both before the solicitor holding Josip's satchel filed its contents with any one official. He stood. "Lady Constance, I need to take this tonight." "I assumed as much." She looked at him steadily. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to end it," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have at the moment." He held her gaze. "But I'll send word when it's finished." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at Evelina, and the look between them was the kind that went too deep for translation. "Your mother was right about one thing," she said to Evelina. "She said that when the moment came, you would need someone who operated from the same principles she did. Not sentiment, not authority." A pause. Precision. She did not look at Cassian when she said it, but the words sat between all 3 of them. The document examiner worked through the night. His name was Roth. He operated out of a workroom on the south side of the city, And his particular skill, the thing that distinguished him from the half-dozen other men who did similar work in the city, was that he did not simply identify forgeries. He identified the mechanics of forgery, the specific techniques, the materials, the trained hand versus the amateur one, the patterns that connected one forged document to another if both had passed through the same source. Cassian sat in Wraith's outer room from 9 o'clock until past midnight, and Evelina sat across from him, and between them was a silence that had shifted from the functional silence of two people managing a crisis into something different. The silence of two people who have been through enough in a short time to have run out of the social architecture that usually filled the space between strangers. At 11, she said, "What made you take off your cloak?" He looked at her. "The night of the gathering," she said. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. There were 100 people in that room and not one of them moved." He considered the question with the same quality of attention he gave to every question she asked, which had turned out to be the quality of someone who asked things in order to understand rather than to position. "Because the alternative was to be one of the 100 people who didn't move," he said, "and I'm not able to be that person." "Most men of your rank are." "Most men of my rank," he said, "have spent so long managing what they're seen to do that they've lost track of what they actually do. They're the same person in private and in public, just performing different versions of inaction." She looked at him with that direct, unpretentious attention. "And you're not." "I try not to be." He paused. "I don't always succeed." She held his gaze for a moment, then, very quietly, "Thank you for the cloak. I didn't say it properly before." "You said it exactly right before." "I said 2 words." 2 was enough. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. It was the first thing he had seen on her face that was entirely unmanaged, that had arrived without going through the composure first. He looked away before it could become something he catalogued. Tut. Wraith emerged at 20 past midnight with the expression of a man who had found what he was looking for and was not entirely happy about how much of it there was. "The documents from the box," he said, "are genuine. I can confirm it on the original marriage settlement, the Whitmore letters, and the personal correspondence. Paper, ink, wear pattern, all consistent with the dates indicated." He set them on the work table with a care that suggested he understood their value. "The documents from the secondary set," he stopped. "Say it," Cassian said. "The documents Sable recovered copies of from the solicitor's office." Wraith put them beside the genuine set. "Same paper source, different hand, but it's a trained copy of a genuine hand. So specifically, it's a trained copy of Evelina Harrow's handwriting. Someone spent considerable time practicing it." He pointed to 3 specific documents. "These 3 are the problem. They're good enough to pass a casual examination. They would not survive a direct comparison against confirmed genuine samples, but in a legal proceeding where the defense has to actively argue for that comparison, the burden becomes theirs," Evelina said. "Yes, Miss Harrow." "How long would it take to produce this quality of forgery?" Cassian asked. Wraith considered. "Several months of preparation. The hand practice alone, to get to this level of consistency. That's not a rushed job. Someone began this well before whatever triggered the legal filing. Before the gathering. Before Fenwick's invitation. Before any of it had been visible." Cassian looked at the 2 sets of documents side by side on Wraith's work table. The genuine and the fabricated, the real history and the constructed one. Both of them sitting under lamplight, looking equally material, equally present, equally capable of being believed by someone who wanted to believe them. This was what 3 years of preparation looked like. Not a sudden attack, a patient replacement of reality with a version of reality that served a different purpose. He thought about Graydon. 21 years. The trouble pile. The everyday China. He picked up the genuine documents. "I need written certification of your findings," he said to Wraith. "By 6 in the morning. Can you do it?" Wraith looked at the documents, looked at Cassian, calculated. "Yes." "Then do it." Yum. He moved before dawn. Not to the Harrow house. Not yet. First to Aldgate, who had responded to his letter with the 2 words that meant he understood the situation and was prepared. "I'm ready." Aldgate had connections to 2 members of the Northern Judiciary that Caldwell did not own, and his family name carried the specific weight of people who had been honorable in a particular geography for a very long time. In the kind of proceeding that was coming, that weight mattered. Courts were not purely mechanical. They were human institutions, and human institutions responded to the presence of unimpeachable people. Then to the Edinburgh solicitor by correspondence, confirming the arrangements Cassian had outlined in his letter. The Edinburgh man had access to financial records from a network of northern banking houses that crossed county lines, and what Cassian needed from him was simple: the paper trail of where Phineas Harrow's money had actually gone in the last 2 years of his life, against whose account it had landed, and whose signature had authorized the movements. Then, at 5:30 in the morning, as the city was beginning to make its first sounds, carts, a distant shout, the incremental awakening of a place that ran on commercial time, Cassian went back to Ashbourne House. Graydon was already awake. He was always already awake. He met Cassian in the entrance hall with the same posture, the same quiet efficiency, and the same carefully neutral expression that Cassian had read for 21 years as the face of a loyal man. "I need the drawing room prepared," Cassian said. "Full configuration. The large table, chairs enough for 20, and send for the following people." He handed Graydon a list he had written himself, by hand, in the carriage. Graydon read it. His expression did not change. The list included Lord Aldgate, Lady Pemberton, the 2 members of the Northern Judiciary, 3 specific noble families who had been at the gathering, the attending solicitor Price, who still needed to understand what kind of mistake he had made, Mr. Horton, the magistrate, and at the bottom, added last, Lord Fenwick, Lord Caldwell, Dorothea Harrow, and both her daughters. "This is for today?" Graydon said. "This afternoon, 2 o'clock. Lord Caldwell may not." "Lord Caldwell will come," Cassian said, "because the alternative is that I go to him, and he knows that what I do in his house will not look the same as what I do in mine." He looked at Graydon with the same quality of attention he had always given him, and felt behind it the particular cost of maintaining a face when everything beneath it had changed. "Send for them." "Yes, Your Grace." Cassian went upstairs. He did not sleep. He went to his desk, and he sat with Wraith's certification and Lady Constance's box and the Edinburgh solicitor's preliminary figures, which had arrived by early post in the compressed, precise language of a man who knew how to say damning things without inflection, and he built the afternoon's proceeding the way he built everything, methodically, without sentiment, accounting for every variable he could anticipate. He was nearly finished when there was a knock at the study door that was not Graydon's knock. Graydon knocked with 2 even beats. This knock was 3, uneven, the pattern he had established with Evelina through Mrs. Finch's network as the signal that could not be mistaken for anything else. She was in the doorway in her coat, her face showing the compressed alertness of someone who had not slept and had done something with the wakefulness. "I found something," she said. "Last night, while you were with Rath." He looked at her. "Mrs. Finch's neighbor," she said, "an older man, retired, who used to work as a footman in the Caldwell house. He left their service 12 years ago and has had no contact with them since, which is why he was never visible in this." She came to the desk and set down a letter, old, the paper softened with age. He kept this because he didn't know what to do with it. He found it in a fireplace grate in the Caldwell study 14 years ago, incompletely burned. He kept it because the name on it was my mother's. Cassian picked it up, read it. It was Caldwell's handwriting, a letter he had never sent, or had sent a copy of and kept the original, or had drafted and then decided against. The date was 14 years ago. The content was 6 paragraphs, and the first 5 were the carefully constructed language of a man trying to convince himself of something he had not yet fully decided. The 6th paragraph was different. It was shorter, and it was written in the cramped, pressured hand of someone who had arrived at a conclusion they were committing to paper precisely because committing it to paper made it real. The 6th paragraph described, in terms that were indirect but not indirect enough, a plan. A patient plan. A plan for what would happen to the Harrow estate and its contents once the inconveniently principled first wife was no longer in the picture. Written 14 years ago, when Evelina's mother was still alive. Cassian set the letter down. He had been in this business long enough to know what he was looking at. This was not opportunism. This was not Caldwell responding to Phineas Harrow's death and seeing an opening. This was a plan that predated Margaret Harrow's death, possibly predated her illness, possibly, and the word possibly was doing significant work in his mind, had something to do with the speed and direction of her decline. The room was absolutely silent. He looked at Evelina. She had already read it. She had brought it to him having already sat with what it meant, having already made whatever internal adjustments were required to continue functioning with that knowledge inside her. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since 2 in the morning," she said. "I needed to be sure I was reading it correctly before I brought it to you." "You're reading it correctly." She nodded once. Her face was very still, not the composure of someone managing grief, something past grief, something that had gone through grief and come out the other side into a kind of cold, absolute clarity that Cassian recognized because he had felt it twice in his own life and knew what a person was capable of when they arrived there. "This changes the scope," he said. "Yes. The afternoon's proceeding can still hold everything, but this," he looked at the letter, "this goes beyond inheritance fraud. This is something that requires the judiciary, not just the nobility." "I know." "Are you prepared for what that means?" She met his eyes. "I have been preparing for what that means since I was 17 years old and watched them close my father's study door and understood for the first time that I was on my own." She paused. "I'm ready." He looked at her for a moment. This young woman who had been strategically diminished and systematically isolated and positioned at the edge of every room and offered no quarter and had spent 3 years building a quiet, invisible capability that no one had thought to watch for because everyone had been too busy watching the edges of his territory to notice what was growing in the space they thought they'd already taken. He thought, she is going to be formidable when this is over. The thought arrived without complication and without the category error of sentiment. It was simply true, and he had always responded to true things with the same unadorned recognition. He stood. 2 o'clock, he said. "Are you ready to be in the room?" "Yes." "They're going to try to make you small in that room. Every person in that room who is connected to Caldwell or Fenwick is going to look at you and attempt to perform the judgment they believe you can't survive." "Let them," she said. It was exactly what he had said to her about the gossip 2 days ago in the East Gallery, in what felt like a different life. She said it differently than he had. He had said it from the position of a man who had never needed to care what rooms thought of him. She said it from the position of a woman who had survived 3 years of being made small and had decided, apparently, definitively, that she was finished with that particular experience. He picked up the documents. "Then let's go finish it." And at that precise moment, the door of the study opened. Not Evelina's knock, not the 2 even beats of Graydon's knock, but the sound of a door opened by someone who had a key and did not feel the need to announce themselves. And Lord Caldwell walked into the study of Ashbourne House with 2 men behind him who were not his servants, and his face wore the expression of a man who had decided that the meeting at 2 o'clock was too long to wait for. Caldwell closed the door behind him. He did it quietly, which was the most aggressive thing about it. The performance of a man who believed he had already won and could therefore afford to be calm. He was 64, heavy through the chest, with the particular physical confidence of a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where other people deferred to him. The 2 men behind him were not servants. They had the stillness of hired muscle wearing decent coats, the kind of men retained specifically for situations where social pressure had run out. Cassian did not move. This was the thing about reaching a certain level of actual danger. It clarified. The performance of authority fell away, because there was no longer any audience for it, and what remained was the stripped-down mechanics of a man deciding what he was willing to do. Cassian stood beside his desk with Wraith's certification and Lady Constance's documents in his hand, and he felt something that was not fear and was not courage, because neither of those were precise enough. It was the particular focused quiet of a man who had run every calculation available to him and had arrived at the last decision point. Caldwell looked at the documents in his hand. "I'd like those," Caldwell said. "I know," Cassian said. "I think you understand the situation well enough to—" "I understand the situation precisely," Cassian said. "You've entered my house with men you intend to use as physical leverage to take documents that would end your freedom if they reached a court. You've done this because you have someone inside my household who told you I had them, and because you calculated that arriving before 2 o'clock gave you options that arriving at 2 o'clock would not." He looked at Caldwell with the complete, undecorated attention of a man who had stripped every social function out of the moment. "You calculated wrong." Caldwell's expression shifted, Not much, the shift of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation, but was now detecting that the version he was in was not among them. Your Grace, you sat in my drawing room last night, Cassian said. You discussed the southern boundary survey with me for 4 minutes while your people were at the solicitor's table. You looked me in the eye, he paused. 30 years, Caldwell. You were Phineas Harrow's closest friend for 30 years. You were in the room when Evelina was born, and you began planning what to take from her before her mother was dead. The room went absolutely still. Caldwell's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're... I have the letter, Cassian said. The one you wrote 14 years ago and didn't burn completely. The one your former footman kept because he didn't know what it meant and didn't know what to do with it and eventually gave to the one person it was about. He did not look at Evelina. He did not need to. He could feel her to his left, absolutely still, breathing evenly, the composure of someone who had decided that this room and this moment were hers, and she would not spend them on anything that was not useful. I have Whitmore's letters to Margaret Harrow. I have the original settlement documents. I have your financial records going back 30 months, courtesy of a solicitor in Edinburgh whose existence you are not aware of. And I have a certification from the best document examiner in the North confirming that the papers Joseph delivered to your solicitor yesterday morning are forgeries constructed from Evelina Harrow's handwriting. He set the documents on the desk. The 2 men behind you, he said, should leave, now, because what happens to them in the next 60 seconds if they stay is not something I can moderate. One of the men glanced at Caldwell. Caldwell said nothing. The man looked at Cassian. Whatever he saw in Cassian's face, it was sufficient. He took 1 step back. His companion did the same. Neither of them had been paid enough for whatever this had become. They left. Caldwell stood alone in the center of the study. The confidence had not left his face entirely, but it had curd pulled, still present but hollowed out, the husk of a thing that had been structural and was now merely habitual. You can't prove intent, Caldwell said. The letter is old. The financial records are open to interpretation. Whitmore's letters are hearsay from a dead man. Whatever you think you have, what I have, Cassian said, is enough. Not for a criminal conviction today. You know that and I know that. But enough to open an inquiry, enough to put your name in a proceeding, enough that every family in the North reads it in the same week your son is trying to negotiate his marriage settlements. He held Caldwell's gaze. And enough that Evelina Harrow gets her inheritance back, her name restored, and the full weight of this duchy's documentation confirming that everything taken from her was taken fraudulently. Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. Thought, this is about the girl, he said, and the dismissal in the word girl was the last remnant of the version of this situation he had planned for. The version where Evelina Harrow was a peripheral figure in a legal dispute, rather than the person standing in this room who had just watched 30 years of her family's history laid out in 4 sentences. Say her name correctly, Cassian said. Very quiet. Something moved through Caldwell's expression that was too old and too honest to be anything other than what it was. The face of a man who had just understood that he had fundamentally misjudged every variable in this situation, and that the miscalculation had not begun last night at the gathering or 3 years ago when Phineas Harrow died, but 14 years ago when he looked at a woman and a child and decided they were manageable. He said nothing more. He left. But Cassian stood alone with Evelina for the first time since Caldwell had walked through the door, and the silence between them was the particular silence of 2 people who have just been through something that has no adequate immediate language. He looked at her. She was standing where she had been throughout, slightly to his left, close enough that he had been aware of her breathing for the last 10 minutes, far enough that she had maintained the particular autonomy she always maintained. Her face was not composed exactly. The composure was still there, but it had changed again, and this time it had changed in the direction of something he could not quite name, something that looked like the aftermath of a very long fight in which the fighter has finally understood that it is over. He'll try again, she said. Yes, differently, and in smaller ways, and with less leverage each time. He looked at her. But today is finished. She nodded slowly. Something in her chest was moving. He could see it in the small rise and fall of her breath, slower now than it had been, the body releasing what it had been holding. Graydon, she said. I'll deal with Graydon. Today? After 2 o'clock. He paused. After you have everything confirmed officially. After the documents are in the hands of people who cannot be managed or redirected. He looked at the desk, at the pile of papers that had been one woman's patient preparation for the protection of her daughter, left in a box in a narrow house for 3 years, waiting. Then I'll deal with Graydon. She looked at him. What will you do with him? Give him the opportunity to tell me everything, which is the only currency he has left. He said it without heat, because heat would have been imprecise. What he felt about Graydon was not rage. It was the particular clean grief of a man who had trusted someone for 21 years and had just learned what that trust had been worth. And grief was less useful than clarity, so he was choosing clarity. And then I'll remove him from this house and ensure he understands the cost of using anything he knows against any person associated with this proceeding. That's more mercy than he earned, she said. It's not mercy, he said. It's management. She looked at him for a moment, and the corner of her mouth moved in that same small, unmanaged way it had moved the night before in Mrs. Finch's front room. You're going to have to get better at the difference. He looked back at her. Probably. The 2 o'clock proceeding ran for 3 hours. Cassian had arranged the drawing room the way he arranged everything, with the kind of spatial precision that made the room itself an argument. The long table centered, the documents arranged in the order they would be needed, the seating configured so that Lord Aldgate and the 2 members of the judiciary sat opposite Fenwick and Dorothea and the Harrow stepsisters, and so that Evelina sat at the table with the same weight as anyone else in the room, not at its edge, not in a position of petition. At the table. Lady Pemberton had arrived 10 minutes early and taken a chair at the corner where she could see everyone. She had said nothing to anyone, which was its own form of statement. Dorothea Harrow had arrived looking composed in the specific way of a woman who had prepared herself for confrontation and was determined to project the confidence of someone who had resources left. She lost that composure incrementally, by degrees, as Wraith's certification was read aloud by the Edinburgh solicitor, and then the Whitmore letters, and then the original settlement documents, and then the financial records. Each one landed differently. The certification was technical, and she managed it. The Whitmore letters were damaging, and she managed those too, with the particular skill of a woman who had been managing damaging information for years. The financial records broke her composure the way a specific structural failure broke a building, not all at once, but at the precise point where the load exceeded the tolerance, and then comprehensively. Fenwick did not speak for the first 90 minutes. When he did speak, it was to his solicitor in a voice low enough that it was not quite audible, and his solicitor's response, visible in expression rather than words, clearly did not satisfy him. Edmund Fenwick, seated behind his father, had the face of a man who was calculating what version of this story he could inhabit afterward and was not finding good options. Philippa and Cecily Harrow sat with the particular stillness of people who had believed they were watching someone else's destruction and had arrived to find they were the exhibit. Philippa's hands were in her lap. She did not look at Evelina once, which told Cassian more than looking would have. Lord Aldgate spoke clearly without editorializing, presenting the framework of the legal proceeding that would follow, the restoration of Evelina's inheritance, the filing of fraudulent documentation charges against the parties responsible, the referral of the Whitmore matter to the appropriate criminal inquiry. He spoke with the authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to perform authority, and the room felt the difference. When Aldgate finished, the room was silent. Cassian looked at Dorothea Harrow. You have the opportunity, he said, to cooperate with the proceeding that follows. The scope of what that cooperation affects is something you should discuss with your solicitor before you make any decisions. But I'll tell you plainly that the inquiry into Whitmore's death will proceed regardless, and the degree to which you were a knowing party to that will be a question that receives thorough attention. Dorothea looked at him. Her face had settled into the expression of a woman who had arrived at the floor of something and found it harder than expected. She said nothing. Then we're finished here, Cassian said. The room emptied by degrees. Fenwick left quickly, without looking at Cassian, which was the first intelligent decision Cassian had observed him make. The judiciary members stayed to complete the formal documentation. Aldgate stayed. Lady Pemberton stayed, sitting in her corner chair, and when the room had cleared enough that she could speak without an audience, she looked at Evelina and said, Your mother would have enjoyed this afternoon very much. Evelina looked at her. Did you know her? Briefly, A long time ago, Lady Pemberton stood with the same deliberate economy as Lady Constance, the movement of women who had learned not to waste themselves. She had your quality of attention. It's rarer than people realize. She looked at Cassian. You should know that most of us in that room last night understood more than you thought we did. We were waiting to see what you would do. She picked up her gloves. You did well enough. She left. Cassian stood with enough well enough for a moment. From Lady Pemberton, he understood, this was the equivalent of an ovation. Passimt. He dealt with Graydon at 5:30. He did not conduct it in the study. He conducted it in the Blue Parlor, which was the room where Fenwick's steward had sat 3 days ago with his rehearsed strategy and his expensive clothes, and which was far enough from the household's operational center that the conversation would not be overheard. He sat. He did not gesture for Graydon to sit, which had always been the signal for a specific kind of interview, and Graydon, reading it, remained standing. How long? Cassian said. Graydon looked at him with the face of a man who had known this was coming and had spent some amount of time preparing for it, and was now discovering that the preparation had not adequately accounted for what it would feel like. 14 years, he said. 14 years? Which meant it had begun before Phineas Harrow died, before Margaret Harrow died. Which meant that for 14 years Graydon had been a fixture in this house, managing its correspondence and its intelligence and its most sensitive information, and had been reporting to Caldwell. What did he have on you? Cassian said. A pause. Graydon was not a man who showed things easily, but in this pause something showed. Not guilt, because guilt required a simpler moral architecture than the situation offered. Something older and more complicated. The face of a man who had made a decision in a moment of weakness 14 years ago and had spent every subsequent year building a life on top of it in the hope that the foundation would eventually stop mattering. My brother, Graydon said. He was in Caldwell's debt, a significant debt, the kind that ended careers. He paused. Caldwell offered to resolve it, in exchange for access to this household's correspondence. It was supposed to be temporary. It was never temporary. No. Quiet. It wasn't. Cassian looked at him. He looked at the man who had sent for Sable with the speed of someone who knew exactly what was needed, who had placed the letter through the servant's entrance, or had known it was coming and had not told him, who had managed the trouble pile for 21 years with the practiced efficiency of a man serving 2 offices simultaneously. He looked at him and felt, underneath the clear-eyed assessment of what Graydon had done, the complicated and unwelcome reality that people were rarely simply one thing. That a man could be genuinely good at a job and genuinely compromised in it simultaneously. That loyalty and betrayal were not always opposites, but were sometimes, in the architecture of a real human life, layered on top of each other in ways that defeated simple categorization. He did not forgive Graydon. That was not on offer, and was not what the moment required. Tell me everything, he said. Everything you reported, every communication, every name. You'll give it to me in writing, signed, and you'll give it completely. In exchange, I won't pursue you legally, and I'll provide you a reference that allows you to find other employment outside this city. He held his gaze. If I discover later that the account was incomplete, the agreement ends. Graydon looked at him for a long moment. Yes, Your Grace. Then sit down, Cassian said, and start from the beginning. Evelina came to Ashbourne House that evening, not to the drawing room or the East Gallery. Cassian was in the garden, which was where he had gone when Graydon's 3-hour account was finally complete, and he needed the particular quality of outside air that came after a long time in a closed room with difficult truth. The September evening was cold and clear, the kind of cold that was honest about itself, and he had been standing in it for approximately 20 minutes when he heard the gate and turned. She was in a different coat than she had worn for the past 3 days. She had been back to the house, not the Harrow house, which was no longer in any practical sense her house, but to Lady Constance's narrow address on the east side, where he had sent word that she was welcome to stay for the duration of the legal proceedings. The coat was dark blue, well-fitted, and it was hers, not an adjustment, not something chosen for her. The small difference was significant in a way he did not examine too directly. She came to stand near him, not beside him, a few feet of garden between them, and she looked at the back of the house the way she had looked at the Yorkshire Moor painting, actually seeing it. How is Lady Constance? He said. Pleased with herself, Evelina said. She said she always knew the box would be worth keeping. She said my mother knew how to read a situation and plan 40 steps ahead. A pause. She said the same about me, which I thought was generous until I realized she was not being generous. She was stating what she considered to be a fact. She was right. Evelina looked at him. You had Mrs. Finch's network, he said. You had Lady Constance. You had 3 years of careful observation of everyone in that house and what they were doing and when. You had the footman with the letter. You were already building this before I was involved. I accelerated it. I didn't construct it. She was quiet for a moment. In the garden, something moved. A bird, late in the day, settling somewhere in the hedgerow with a brief sound and then silence. I've been thinking about something you said, she said, on the first night in the East Gallery. You said there was nothing to thank you for. I remember. I've been trying to decide if I believe you meant it. I meant it. I know. She turned to look at him, and the evening light was doing something to her face that the candlelight inside had not, showing it more plainly without the theater of the gathering or the compression of crisis. That's what I've been thinking about. Most people do things like that and mean them as currency, as investment, as the first step in a transaction they expect to complete later. She paused. You didn't. No. Why not? He considered this. The question deserved the same quality of answer she always gave him. Not performed, not strategic, simply true. Because I was tired, he said, of being the only person in every room who was thinking about what things cost, about what every action bought and what it obligated. I looked at you standing there and I thought, she's not asking for anything. She's not performing. She's just standing there trying not to collapse, and every single person in this room is deciding it's not their problem. He looked at the darkening garden. I don't know how to be that person. I've tried, in other circumstances, and it costs me something I don't get back. She was quiet. That's not noble, he said. That's just the limit of what I'm able to be. It's more than you think, she said. The garden was very still. The last of the evening light was going, the sky above the hedgerow darkening from gray to something deeper, and the cold was settling in properly now, the kind of cold that asked something of you. He turned to look at her directly. The legal proceedings will take several months. The inquiry into Whitmore's death will take longer. During that time, your presence in this city as an unprotected single woman with active enemies in the legal system is a vulnerability. He said it plainly, because she had always received plainness better than anything else. I would like to offer you the protection of this household's name, formally, as my wife. She looked at him. I am asking you, he said, not deciding, not managing, asking. The silence between them was the specific silence of a moment that had its own weight, that both of them understood was not a small thing dressed in practical language, but a real thing, a significant thing, and he held it without trying to fill it because she deserved the time to look at it clearly. The last time someone offered me protection, she said, they meant a cage with better furniture. I know. I told you in the East Gallery, I won't exchange one prison for another. I know that too. Then you understand, she said, that if I say yes, it's because I have looked at you for 3 days under conditions that removed every reason to perform anything, and I have reached my own conclusion. Not because I need your name, not because the legal situation requires it, because I have a particular difficulty with people who are exactly what they appear to be, and you are that. She paused. It's uncommon enough that I find it difficult to walk away from. He looked at her. Yes, she said. Quiet, direct, entirely without ceremony. The word of a woman who had spent 3 years refusing to surrender a single thing that was hers, and who was now choosing, with full knowledge and full autonomy, to add something new. He reached out and she put her hand in his, and neither of them said anything, because they were both people who had long since learned that the moments that mattered most required the least language. The Duchy of Ashbourne ran for 2 more decades under Cassian's governance, and the historians who wrote about that period noted, with varying degrees of understanding, that something shifted in its character in the winter of that year. The shift was difficult to quantify. The legal machinery was the same, the boundaries were the same. The economic structures remained largely intact. What changed was something more interior, more functional. A quality in the way decisions were made, the way information moved, the way people who came to the duchy with grievances were received. Cassian himself, when asked in later years what had changed, gave the same answer every time, and the people who heard it understood it differently depending on what they had survived themselves. He said, "I stopped believing that the point of power was to never need anyone." The Caldwell inquiry ran for 4 years and resulted in a criminal proceeding that was, by the standards of the era, remarkable in its comprehensiveness. Dorothea Harrow cooperated at the final stage, which reduced her exposure but did not eliminate it. Fenwick's family withdrew from Northern society with the particular completeness of a family that understands it has run out of social credit. Edmund Fenwick, who had been peripheral enough to most of the actual conspiracy to make a credible case for limited involvement, spent the subsequent years becoming quietly, determinedly ordinary, which was probably the best outcome available to him. Graydon's written account sat in Cassian's files for the rest of his life, consulted occasionally, never shared. What Cassian did with what it contained was his own business, conducted with the same methodical, unemotional thoroughness he applied to everything, and the people whose names appeared in it discovered, over a period of years, that the comfortable certainties of their positions had developed a gradual and inexplicable fragility. Lady Constance attended the wedding and said that Margaret would have found the flowers excessive, but the choice of man acceptable, which everyone present understood was the highest form of approval she was capable of offering. Lady Pemberton, when asked her opinion of the Duchess of Ashbourne, said only that she had your mother's quality of attention. She said it often enough, to enough people, that it eventually became the thing she was most remembered for saying, which she would have considered an appropriate legacy. Evelina Harrow, Evelina Ashbourne, did not become the quiet figure behind the duchy's decisions. She became a visible one, which surprised people who had expected the Duke's wife to occupy the traditional peripheral position, and which surprised no one who had watched her stand in a drawing room with a torn gown and a level chin and refuse, in the face of 100 witnesses, to be made small. The duchy became, over the following years, a place where the name you were born with was less important than the character you demonstrated. This was not a revolution. It was a recalibration, slow and unglamorous and unglamorous. The kind of change that arrived not as dramatic reversal, but as accumulated choice, decision by decision, in the specific direction of the people doing the deciding. Cassian Ashbourne governed until 61, when he handed the administration to successors he had spent a decade preparing, with the same patient thoroughness he had applied to everything. He did not do it with sentiment. He did it with the same quality of attention he had applied to the trouble pile every morning for 30 years, comprehensively, without flinching, accounting for every variable he could anticipate and accepting the ones he could not. He was not a man who had learned to be softer. He was a man who had learned that softness and strength were not the opposites he had believed them to be in the years when he needed to believe they were opposites in order to function. What replaced that belief was something less convenient and considerably more useful, the understanding that the things worth governing were not territories or assets or even alliances, but the choices you made when the cost of them was real. The study at Ashbourne House, in the years after the Caldwell matter closed, had 2 chairs at the desk instead of 1. This was not symbolic, it was functional. The person in the second chair had her own method, her own intelligence, and her own conclusions, and the conversations that happened in that room between 2 people who had met under a torn gown and a borrowed cloak and a painting with a flawed horizon line were the conversations of a partnership that had never once mistaken agreement for loyalty or silence for peace. They disagreed often, loudly, sometimes, with the particular quality of 2 people who respected each other enough to be honest and trusted each other enough to survive honesty. It was by any reasonable measure enough. It was most days considerably more.